Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from the Highlands at Pittsford, an independent and assisted living community affiliated with the University of Rochester, offering cottage and apartment homes, daily life enrichment activities, and care assistance as needed. More at highlandsatpittsford.org.
From WXXI News, I'm Jasmine Singer, and this is Environmental Connections. Today's Environmental Connection began one frigid evening last winter when I was driving through a rural stretch of western New York. I was on my way home. I had 103 miles of range left in my electric car and just over 90 miles to go. Normally that's plenty, but it was 14 degrees outside and I had the heat cranked up, and the only public fast charger along my route had been under maintenance for weeks. That moment, watching the battery drop faster than expected, nervously refreshing the PlugShare app, it's a familiar one to many EV drivers, and it captures so much of what today's show is about. New York State wants all new vehicles sold by 2035 to be zero emission. But the road to get there, especially in places like Rochester and the Finger Lakes, it's filled with potholes, both literal and metaphorical. So today we're asking, why aren't more people driving EVs? What's standing in the way of this transition, and what needs to happen to get us back on course? Joining me live today are two people who bring very different but complementary expertise to this conversation. In the studio with me is my colleague Brian Sharp, investigative editor here at WXXI, who's been reporting on EV infrastructure and the readiness of it in our region. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
And joining us remotely all the way from France is Eric Hittinger, Associate Professor at RIT and the 2024 President of the U.S. Association for Energy Economics. Welcome, Eric, or should I say bonjour?
Yes, hi. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. Before we get to these two sharp minds, no pun intended, Brian, I spoke earlier with State Senator Jeremy Cooney, chair of the State Senate Transportation Committee and a key player in shaping EV policy across New York. Here's that conversation. Senator Cooney, thank you so much for speaking with me. First of all, I know you're a very, very busy person, and we really appreciate it.
Glad to be here. Happy to help.
And this is a topic that I'm very passionate about, and I know you are too. So let's start with the big picture. New York has what I would say is a bold 2035 zero emissions mandate. So in broad strokes, what are the details of that plan? And from your vantage point, is that goal still realistic?
Well, I can tell you that New York is absolutely committed to our climate goals, both in the CLCPA as well as a signatory to some of the climate agreements that other states have taken on, states like California, where we have signed on as a signatory to their Clean Air Act guidelines. And so those have impacts on our state environmental and air quality policies. So we are committed. Despite some changes at the federal level, we are committed to making sure that those policies do get implemented in New York State. And while the goals may change, our values do not. And so our values stand for making sure that we are reducing our carbon footprint in New York, that we are leaving New York a better place for our next generation, because we know we can't wait. We're already behind the ball, and that we have to catch up. And we're committed to making sure we do that.
And one of the ways I think you're committed to making sure that we're doing that is you've introduced a bill that could delay the advanced clean trucks rule. So can you walk us through what that means and the reasoning behind that?
Yes. So while we want to move towards full electrification of vehicles, and by the way, this is where the rest of the world is going in the same direction. New York is not isolated from what's happening from a technology standpoint and from a lower carbon emission standpoint. My legislation focuses specifically on the trucking industry, recognizing that these big trucks are big polluters, but we want to move towards some of the newer truck technology that is electric vehicles. However, to be able to do that, we have to have the infrastructure in place. When I say infrastructure, I mean charging infrastructure. And unfortunately, from a readiness standpoint, New York does not have one piece of public EV charging infrastructure for these commercial trucks in place at all. So it's one thing to have a goal, but it's another thing to be able to practically implement and achieve that goal. And so my legislation recognizes that we have to do more when it comes to building out that public charging infrastructure for trucks. And we're hoping that with a slight delay, we can put the money where our mouth is and make sure that we are building this infrastructure and then allow these trucks to become electrified and, bring goods across New York State. It's one thing for us to say we want goods to be delivered by a manufacturer to Rochester, or let's say even further up north in Watertown. But if you can't get from New York City to Watertown without a charge, well, then how did the goods get to the destination, right? And we know that 90% of our commerce in New York State is due to trucking. So we don't want to disrupt our economic infrastructure by our lack of readiness with our charging infrastructure. So that's what the legislation addresses.
Well, what is the balance between climate urgency and economic reality?
Well, I think the reality is that the technology does exist. And so what we've seen in other states and other parts of the world is that they are making those municipal infrastructure investments, meaning that state governments or local governments are building out charging infrastructure, changing the culture when it comes to electric vehicles. And so people feel more confident, consumers feel more confident, whether they're driving a personal automobile or whether they are accompanied with an electric fleet of trucks, that they can get from point A to point B safely and responsibly and not have to worry about access to charging. So that's really what we're focused on, is to really motivate and push the state of New York to ensure that this infrastructure is put into place. I think also the key is we're not falling behind what we're seeing happen in other states. We don't want to just say, hey, we're not ready for this, so we'll deal with this in a few years later, kicking the can down the road. That's not responsible. We have to acknowledge that we have goals for a reason, and they are aggressive goals, and we should be doing everything possible to meet those goals. So we don't want to just say, we'll talk about this later. We want to say, what can we be doing now to be ready and prepared to make this clean energy transition?
Well, and on the subject of what we can be doing now, are we truly investing enough in charging stations, particularly outside of New York City?
No, the answer is no. We don't have enough charging stations. We don't have enough signage. We don't have enough recognition that this is something that can't just be done on the New York State Thruway, but has to be done in municipalities as well. Again, we know that the technology exists from a battery storage standpoint so that vehicles, whether they are trucks or personal automobiles, can get from point A to point B on fully electric charging, right? The range that these vehicles can go because of technology improvements and battery improvements has increased, but we still have to have that charging infrastructure in place. So one of the things I'm most disappointed by is that we did all this money on the Thruway rest stops, right? We heard about this over the last couple of years, right? These new Thruway rest stops, but there's still only a few chargers. And by the way, they're only Tesla chargers, right? So did we really meet the moment when it came to putting in the charging infrastructure when we were doing a major construction process? I would say we did not. And so let's not do that again. Let's learn from that. And let's really put the money where our mouth is in terms of making funds, grants available so that local communities like Rochester or Monroe County have the resources to build out this charging infrastructure. It should not be just for some people. Everyone should have access to vehicle charging stations of some sort, whether it's for the personal automobile or, again, trucking or school buses, which is another hot topic as well.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because you have been very vocal in support of tax credits for EV buyers. Can you clarify how your proposed state incentives would work, especially for used cars and low income buyers?
So what we have heard from the Trump administration in Washington is that they seek to stop the $7,500 EV tax credit that was passed by Congress through the Inflation Reduction Act. This is a credit when if you're looking to purchase an electric vehicle, you go into your dealer, you find a vehicle that you like, it's fully electric, you are then eligible for a $7,500 tax credit if it's a new vehicle. If it's a used vehicle, it's a $4,000 tax credit. Again, this is just for EVs. That credit at the federal level is going away. The agency that administers that credit, which is the EPA, has already signaled that. The Trump administration has already signaled this. And so what I would like to do is to pass legislation at the state level to say New York State will still honor that tax credit of $7,500 for new EVs or $4,000 for used EVs. Because we know that the number of sales of EVs in New York and in the United States, by the way, is actually going down. Going down. We're going the wrong direction. Why is that? Well, affordability, but also what they call range anxiety. People don't believe that they can get there to their destinations on an electric charge versus a what we call an ICE vehicle, an internal combustion engine, gas-powered vehicle. So, at a time when we should be finding more ways to incentivize people to make that transition to a fully electric vehicle, which are very nice vehicles, by the way, then we need to put our money where our mouth is again. And if the federal government's going to cut, New York's going to invest. So my legislation basically mirrors the federal tax credit for EV sales on the state level. And I'm hoping we can get that done next year.
Well, and I'll say I drive an electric car, an EV6, not a Tesla. And I recently had to drive to New York City and back in the same day, by the way. It was possible, but it required a lot of creativity and a lot of stopping at very random places. So I mentioned I'm passionate about this. I have personal reasons for it too. I'm curious because you sort of touched on this a few minutes ago. The federal government's NEVI program is funneling money into fast chargers along major corridors. But what about those places in between, like smaller towns and rural communities, or even cities in Rochester, which last I checked, and it wasn't in the last month, but last I checked, there were no fast chargers, just slower ones that would be unrealistic for someone just driving through town.
Yeah, this is something that's going to not just be the responsibility of our federal partners, but really require state governments to step up. We are part of a coalition, and the Governor Hochul, to her credit, has made New York State a member of a coalition of clean car standards, and recognizing that, again, this is not an option. This is not something nice to do. This is a necessity to do to make sure that we are meeting our climate goals. But we need to make these investments in communities of all sizes. When I think about New York State, I want to make sure that where the vehicles are being most driven, which is, by the way, outside of New York City, right? Because we don't have a robust public transportation system like New York City that has subways and buses and a big taxi program, et cetera, right? So a community like Rochester, where we have RTS, and we're fortunate to have RTS, but still people still use personal automobiles. So we have to make sure that the charging infrastructure is in place. And I agree, fast charging is the way to go, because again, if you're going to change the culture of driving, where we're moving to electric vehicles, where we're reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and gasoline, and by the way, saving consumers that money, right? We want to make sure that they have access from an equity perspective to fast charging infrastructure. And by the way, I'm not necessarily saying that taxpayers have to pay for free charging here, right? It's building the infrastructure so that there could be charging, paid charging opportunities available. Right now, we're reliant on employer-based or parking garage-based infrastructure. That's okay. That's a good first step. But again, if you really want to change that culture and get to more electrification of vehicles, this has to be widespread. Just like when you drive down a street in our suburb or on Main Street, you see multiple gas stations. It should be the same way. When you drive down a street, there are multiple opportunities for multiple speeds of charging, right? That's just the way we're going to move our economy into a greener economy.
Do you think this program is at risk in the Trump administration?
I absolutely do. I mean, let's be very clear about this. This is a president who does not agree with the electrification of vehicles. And despite the science, despite the studies, despite the fact that, again, other parts of our world are moving in this direction, he has doubled down and said that we are going to stick with gas-powered cars and take away grant opportunities, funding opportunities, research opportunities, infrastructure opportunities from red states and blue states alike. It's ridiculous. I mean, let me give you an example of this. China saw a 32% increase in EV sales in this past year. Europe, as a continent, saw a 35% increase in EV sales. North America decreased EV auto sales by 5%.
Wow.
I mean, where are we? I mean, we are not aligned with where the rest of the world is going. And again, I understand the consumer hesitancy behind this technology without the infrastructure. So really, look, as the chair of transportation for the state senate, my role is to make sure that the resources, the dollars are there in our budget so that private developers and municipal government, local governments have the resources and access to build out this infrastructure so that we as consumers, as New Yorkers, we get access to it, right? And that's how we stay competitive with other states like North Carolina and Virginia and Texas and California and Florida that are doing this type of infrastructure investment.
I want to go back to trucks for a second because you were talking about it before, and I know that trucking companies have raised some real concerns, battery weight, charging access, cost. What is the path forward that keeps them in the fold without derailing the climate agenda?
So it's a give and take. A lot of those concerns are absolutely valid. Yes, that does make trucks heavier, and that has an impact, by the way, on our surface pavement, on our roads, right? So they're worried about that, and that's a fair consideration. They also are correct in the sense that there isn't any public infrastructure, charging infrastructure available. So they're worried about the practical nature of this well. But that has to get balanced against the goals, right? They know and they agree that this type of technology is where we're headed. This is an efficiency standpoint. This is a climate justice standpoint. I don't want to see any community, whether they're upstate like us in Rochester or a borough in New York City like Staten Island. I don't want to see either of those communities have to continue to see their air quality decrease, to have children inhale toxins because we can't figure out how to get these trucks on the road, right? Again, look what's happening right now in Rochester with our Amazon deliveries, right? However you feel about Amazon, right? I know there's a big corporation, I get it. But however you feel about Amazon, they have chosen to invest in all electric van delivery services, Rivian, right? You see those light gray vans going around Rochester streets, right? Fully electric charged, right? That's a commitment that Amazon has made in their climate program, right? That aligns with what New York is trying to do with overall trucking policy. And so when you and I are driving along the thruway or driving on 490 or 390, We should see less of these big gas guzzling trucks spitting out that black smoke into the air. And we should have cleaner vehicles instead, which, by the way, that technology exists for them. So it's just about building the infrastructure so that they can utilize that technology. So for me, this is an economic issue, it's an environmental issue, but it's also a public health issue for our children and our families who live in communities that need access to electric vehicles.
I couldn't agree more. My wife is an asthmatic, and we have made a lot of changes in our personal day-to-day, in our lives. We moved from New York City to Los Angeles to Rochester because of climate. That's what landed us here. And it is just so devastating to see the amount of air pollution that exists, especially given the high propensity toward, people with asthma these days. It is a public health issue. It's a justice issue. But I have just a few more questions for you. I want to stick with the subject of weight really quickly, because incentives for EVs don't differentiate between more efficient, lighter EVs and heavy trucks. So since heavier vehicles may need charging more often, wouldn't incentivizing lighter EVs help the transition?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that argument as well, and we certainly can take a look at that. I think a lot of it is, where is the technology available? What are the costs of the technology upgrades? We just want people to start this transition. For me, it's not about what is the most perfect outcome in terms of what type of vehicle they're using. It's the fact that they've converted from an internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle. And there's different, by the way, technologies being developed that we can put into our roadways that senses different weights. And so for trucks who are driving along a interstate, for example, they could, instead of having to pull off and be weighed, it could automatically sense the weight of the vehicle. And maybe there are some incentives, as you said, that could be given, which would, again, financially motivate these large companies to think differently. Look, we know that trucking isn't going away, and we don't want it to go away, right? A lot of these are good paying jobs. A lot of these are done by, very good drivers, members of the Teamsters Union, for example. That's fine. Let's continue that. We want to make sure that goods can get from one point of our state to the other, but let's utilize the best form of technology to be able to do that.
Last question for you. If we don't make the 2035 mandate, what does that mean for New York's climate goals?
Well, again, these are goals, and we have a serious commitment to achieving those goals. Goals are also statement of values, and those of us who are elected to state office are absolutely committed to adhering to those values, right? These are our communities, these are our children, these are our friends who are going to be impacted if we don't take action now to reduce our carbon footprint. Now, there are things that we can do to be reasonable against those goals. So we hear oftentimes, well, we'd like to be able to have electric school buses, but we're not so sure we can get the power if we want to build a charging station, or we're not so sure that there's a electric school bus manufacturer that can deliver the bus by the certain deadline, right? So we've put in place in this year's state budget a 2-year delay waiver, right? So that they could apply, school districts who have been trying to meet this goal could apply to the state education department for a 2-year delay, right? Again, we're not about punishing people. We're just about being intentional about hitting these climate goals. If we're not doing anything and just sitting on our hands, then we are doing a disservice to every New Yorker. And so for those of us who believe in science, who believe in the public health benefit, who recognize that, by the way, there's a public health disparity, especially in communities of color and low income communities. So I represent the city of Rochester, right? 50% of our kids live below the federal poverty line. We are a majority Black and brown city. So you better believe there's a health disparity already in place in the district I represent. So I have a responsibility as an elected representative to make sure that I am doing everything I can from an environmental policy standpoint to reduce the health impacts that has on the community I represent. So this is a moral call for us to act. And we need leaders who not only hear that call, but are committed to passing the public policy and to devoting the resources to get it done.
State Senator Jeremy Cooney, thank you so much for shedding light on this very important topic, and thank you for all you're doing. I can't tell you how much we appreciate it.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
And that was State Senator Jeremy Cooney. We're going to take a very short break, but when we come back, we'll be joined live by Brian Sharp, investigative editor at WXXI, and Eric Hittinger, energy economist and EV expert from RIT. Stay with us.
Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from Excellus Blue Cross Blue Shield, believing that everyone deserves to be cared for and to live well. Through community investments, partnerships, and education, Excellus Blue Cross Blue Shield is working to address health inequities. More at excellusbcbs.com.
If you're just tuning in, I'm Jasmine Singer, and this is Environmental Connections. Today we're asking, why aren't more people driving EVs? So before the break, you heard from State Senator Jeremy Cooney, chair of the Senate Transportation Committee. In just a moment, we will be joined live by Brian Sharp, investigative editor at WXXI, and Eric Hittinger, and who I will get to pronounce his name correctly for me, the energy economist and EV expert from RIT. But first, we're heading out into the community. The WXXI team stopped by the City of Rochester's EV charging station at Cobbs Hill, where they spoke with some local electric vehicle owners. And when it comes to EV know-how, these folks are, you could say, plugged in.
I convinced my 77-year-old parents to get an electric car. They got a Chevy Bolt, they got it at a killer price, and they love it. My name is Eric Johnson. I'm an early adopter. I've been driving an electric car for about 9 years. We are in a house, and so we have access to charging at home, which I think that's the thing that a lot of people don't know about EVs is you actually have way more options for charging your EV. You don't have to drive to a designated specialized gas station. You can just plug in like a toaster. We're talking a 110 outlet, just like plugging in a lamp. It's really convenient, remarkably convenient, but it does take a long time. So your car is going to charge pretty slow, 3 to 5 miles in an hour. So that's a really trickle charge, that's what we call it, but you could put easy 40, 50 miles in your car overnight. In most days, you're only going to drive that much. So look at that. You don't ever have to go to a gas station again. But for longer trips, you would need to do a level 2 charger like these guys, where you're getting somewhere between like 25 and 30 miles in an hour. Or if you're doing a longer drive, you really need a fast charger. And honestly, Tesla really has the best network. We've taken our electric cars down to Florida 20, 30 times to visit parents. Never once had an issue finding charging. And most of the cars coming out 2025 and later all have the Tesla charging plug as the standard. So that means just about everybody can charge on Tesla's charging network. So you get the benefit if you want a different car.
We're gonna leave this here for a few hours. We're gonna go get lunch together, do a little bit of work. So yeah, this will just be kind of sitting here for a few hours so she can get a little more juice to head home. I'm Matt Reiner, and I bought my EV about a year ago. But overall, finding a charger is not a problem. It's more about, do I need level 2? I can sit and chill, or am I looking for that level 3 experience? So that's your fast charging that will do the majority of your battery in 30 minutes. The city center does not offer that. I have to drive out of Rochester to find that. Those are the things that you want to put near an economic center like food and shopping, where people traveling through, or people who are like, I want to go to the Museum of Play, but only for a few hours. We need those types of chargers in the city. And currently you have to go down to Henrietta to a dealership, or the main chargers are in Victor. So that's a problem the city needs to fix. Even at a place like this would be epic, right? Food, a park. But instead, this is meant for kind of lingering. If I went in there and worked for half a day, I could get a good amount of miles. But otherwise, getting a lunch and plugging in here is not going to be super valuable to me.
And joining me now, live, alas, finally, is Brian Sharp, the investigative editor at WXXI, who regularly reports on the state of EV infrastructure in our region. And also with us is Eric Hittinger. Eric, how do you pronounce your name?
So officially it's Hittinger, but I'll tell you, in France it's Hittinger, and it depends on where I am. So I'm pretty flexible about it.
Okay, well, I'm going to not do the French one because you don't want to hear that. But Eric Hittinger, Eric Hittinger, there we go. Energy economist and EV expert from RIT. You're joining us all the way from France. Thank you both again for being here. Brian, I want to start with you. In your recent reporting, what did you find about how prepared or unprepared we are for an EV surge here in the Rochester area?
Well, I think it's multifaceted. It's both the interest in people to buy them. It's a lot of the things that our guests already have talked about, or the people we've interviewed, the charging anxiety. Right now, I'd spoke with some folks here a couple months ago, and they put the penetration rate for EVs across the state at 9 to 10%. Take out Teslas, it's down to 7% for all other manufacturers. And remember, we're trying to get to a goal here with the 2026 model year of 35%.
Wow.
So that's a challenge. And coming with that, and I think the reason folks are wanting that target paused is that there are financial penalties, to be direct. I'd probably call them something else. For manufacturers, if you don't reach that. So you either pay that, which, we've all got a lesson on additional fees attached, and that eventually gets to the consumer, or you bring in fewer cars. And we saw how that played out, post-pandemic with the supply chain. So I think there's that, and then there's just the capacity of the grid. I did a deeper dive on this a couple of years ago, and if folks head out to the Pittsford Wegmans, they'll see chargers there, 2 of them, if I remember correctly, and that was all they could put in because that was all the capacity allowed. So if you're talking about, and then you look at a map across the city, and the areas that go red are our neighborhoods, are areas of, frankly, lower income areas. So if you're going to talk about reaching everybody, you've got to put those in, as the one driver was saying, in the center city, like downtown. But you also have to put them where people live.
Yeah, you're talking about the equity piece and who's being left out of this transition. And I think that's a very important topic. Senator Cooney talked about that a little bit. What are you hearing, Brian, from folks who are selling EVs and their ability to meet this mandate?
And I think I kind of jumped ahead. That's a little bit with the, just looking at that and what they're going to have to face. Because I think what you saw with the initial surge was the early adopters. My father-in-law was one, jumped in right away. And now you got the folks who are like, okay, wait and see. We're one of those. We bought a hybrid Toyota RAV4 Prime, if I'm getting everything right, because it allows us to plug into the wall overnight, slow charge, gets 30, 40 miles a day. That'll get you to and from work, the grocery store, most of your basic errands. And then, you go on the road. We take a family road trip somewhere. The gas kicks in after that, and you're good to go. And you don't have to be checking as you were where's the nearest charging station. I've heard from folks who, I need to charge. And then I go, and this one's under maintenance.
Well, and I will also say, as a woman who's frequently driving by myself, a lot of the chargers are like in creepy back areas of parking lots with no lights, and my wife would also complain, no squeegees like you get at gas stations. These are very small concerns in the grand scheme of things. But you mentioned climate anxiety, and that is or charging anxiety, one and the same. Potentially, arguably. What is happening locally with public charging and local government's ability to address this charging anxiety? You're talking about a lot of the problems. What kinds of solutions are being put in place?
Well, you saw, and I've been checking back because there was an announcement of folks who were going to bring in, I believe it was fast chargers. They were announced last fall. And I was very curious about that because their thing was we're going to put 2 downtown and we're going to put 2 out in the neighborhoods at a rec center or things of that nature. And I wanted to talk to them more so about what they faced in trying to site those and trying to find that capacity. They haven't put them in yet. So it's still looking. And I don't know if that's a regulatory thing. It's a whole thing. They can't talk about it until the state, I think, gets to have a press conference or something. But it hasn't happened. It's held up for some reason or another. I don't know if it's capacity, if it's just pushing papers and getting approvals and things of that nature. But we have, to the one person who was out at Cobbs Hill, we have the slower chargers. But yeah, the fast chargers is a challenge. And I think that's where, local governments are looking for assistance. What we're seeing at the federal level isn't very promising for that to move quickly. So I guess, if the state can step up, as Senator Cooney was suggesting, then maybe we'll see that go. But, I pulled just before I came down here numbers on how many EVs we even have in Monroe County. And of course, I will not be able to find that.
I'm fascinated by that. Why don't you look for it while I go to Eric? Eric, I want to bring you in now, Eric Hittinger. You have studied EV adoption nationally and globally, and this'll go with Brian's facts that he's about to throw at us. How does New York stack up?
So New York is one of the states that has higher EV adoption than the average and is growing relatively quickly. And a lot of that is pushed through some of the policy proposals that New York has already put in place, support for EVs, support for EV chargers. Although we do have the challenge, and this was discussed earlier, California in the US is, of course, the leader, but they don't face the same kind of weather challenges that we do, especially in the upstate portion of New York, that in California, the weather is more or less, always nice or not too far from nice weather. And so when we face that colder weather, as as an EV driver, it does mean that your range is more limited. So I'd say that New York is the leading state as far as states that experience colder winters.
That's fascinating. And you're absolutely right. I think we're up with our Kia EV6, we're up to like 240 miles now, but it's well below 200 when it's cold out. And Brian, you mentioned your sort of hybrid solution for your road trips. It makes me think of that's actually another argument for getting used EVs, because even if there's a much smaller capacity for miles, it would be enough to take you at least around town for your grocery shopping and your errands. And I suppose this would be more of a solution for cars with two car households. So did you find, by the way, the numbers?
Yeah. So back, just as some reference, the 2022, there were 5,600 EVs on the road in Monroe County, split between battery-powered and plug-in hybrid. There's now 6,900. So it is going up, not at the pace. I looked just to see, you can go on. The state has some incredible open data sources that you can sift and sort and just go down the rabbit holes. But 2023 and newer EVs sold or registered in Monroe County, 2,659, 2023 and newer. So that shows you there's still uptake of these vehicles. But I don't think it's quite what we expected. And just to the point of statewide, this was a couple of years ago, but it probably still holds because we haven't seen a rapid rollout. More than 1 million public and shared charging spots would be needed by 2030 to meet our goals.
I know that a lot of you are calling in and leaving YouTube comments. Thank you for those of you who are doing it and emailing in. We're going to be able to get to a fair amount of you in a few minutes, so hang in there. If you're listening to this and you want to be part of the conversation, we don't have a whole lot of time left. Clearly, this calls for another hour sometime soon, but you can reach us at connections@wxxi.org, or you can call 844-295-TALK. That's 844-295-8255. The local number is 585-263-9994. Eric, what are the biggest myths about EVs that you wish people would let go of?
Yeah. Well, one of them is related to the theme of this conversation, which is that you see these articles about how EV growth is less than expected and it's not quite meeting goals, but EV growth continues to increase year over year. Every year we sell more EVs than the last year. We're not quite on course to hit the really ambitious goals set by New York State, set by the Biden administration. But failure to meet ambitious goals doesn't mean that we're failing in terms of the EV transition. So over the past 5 years, there's been about 8% year over year growth on average in EVs. And every year we sell more EVs than the prior year. 8% growth is an amount that just about any other industry would be envious of. So 8% growth is not what we want to do this quick transition, but 8% growth does still represent people buying more EVs each year. And we're at the point now where actually internal combustion engine vehicle sales are now declining in the US, which is another form of victory. But as far as other things about EVs that I think are important to know, the field interview person mentioned this, that you can charge EVs at home. And for a lot of people, charging EVs relatively slowly at home will be their main way of charging. The only exception are people that live in apartments or rental units where they don't have access to a garage or another place at their home to hook up an EV connection. Although this is another spot where some of the sort of environmental justice elements can come into play, such as subsidizing chargers at apartment buildings so that people who don't have a home with a standalone garage have access to the chargers. And, as far as chargers out in the wild, I think the main reason that you would want a fast charger is when you're traveling those really long distances. So for most people, you need just slow charging tends to do fine around the local neighborhood. So I also have a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, and I still actually use a level 1 charger. I just plug into a wall socket. I don't even have a garage electric charger, and that works fine for all of our needs. And with our car, because it can use gasoline when we drive long distances, we do just use gasoline for that. However, most of the miles driven with our car is driven on electricity. So even though we have a small battery, the range is small, it's perfect for everything we need to do around Rochester on a given day. And only the long trips actually use gasoline. If you have a pure electric vehicle like you do, then the only real time you are searching for that fast charging technology, which tends to be more expensive, is on those long trips, Rochester to New York and back. And you can do most of your charging at home with a slower charger.
Well, actually, we drove to Kansas and back in our electric car. We're masochists, what can I say? But I will say that we went car camping and we plugged in because it was the car camping with electricity. So we plugged in the car when we did that. And that was really kind of useful. One other thing, you mentioned apartments. I had an apartment when I was living in California. This is before I had a car, and I was considering getting an electric one, and there was no charger there at the apartment building. So I mentioned something to my landlord, and he said, you know what, I've been wanting to put one in, so that would be a good excuse. And the reason I bring that up is because sometimes you just need to ask. Sometimes it's just about kind of planting that seed. I'm seeing you nodding, Brian.
And there's an apartment building complex near us that we've seen the charging stations going in there, and I know just in times of covering business and development in the area, you will see people, I think, or developers as a way of maybe helping move their proposal along, that they want to do something that they think is going to face some hurdles. They'll and we're going to throw in some charging stations in there to sort of sweeten the deal and get them through. So there is sort of that is starting to roll out. And, and to Eric's point about the, our plug-in hybrid, I think there's anxiety too about, and it was for me, of sort of, I need all this special equipment. I need some special thing installed. I need to figure out how to reroute. We got whatever the proper term is, high capacity extension cord that runs to, and our neighbors have the same thing. So, it can sit in the garage, or we'll have it sitting out on the driveway with an extension cord running to the level 1 charger and charging the vehicle. Neighbor doesn't have a garage.
Yeah.
They just run it out there and plug it in.
Just don't trip on the wire. I think that one thing that unifies Environmental Connections episodes is that a lot comes down to just having your voice heard. And that makes me feel emboldened personally. I want to go to one of our callers. Thanks for hanging on the line, Alex. Welcome to Environmental Connections. What's your question?
Thank you. Just, I guess, a two-part comment. I am an electric vehicle driver, I guess. Against were some initial concerns, but I couldn't beat the price point after my car sadly crossed the Rainbow Bridge, let's say. And what I found is that, it covers my use case. It is perfectly fine to drive. I drive for work. I'm a corporate trainer. I have to go up and down the thruway regularly, and it works great. I have no concerns with that. What I am concerned with is just a lack of a unified planning process from, I guess, the executive. I mean, Senator Cooney referenced that, there are plenty of people in the legislature who want to see these things succeed. The concerns over electric busing rollout in rural districts, that made a lot of headlines this past week with elections. But what I think gets lost is the energy independence that can easily come from adopting green energy, like just developing wind farms or solar farms and putting them right in your own backyard, setting up the infrastructure right there. You don't have to worry about importing any electricity. You don't have to worry about setting up pipelines, which the governor has now apparently had a heel turn and said, yes, let's start building some gas pipelines, because that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I hear you, especially about the lack of unification. I don't mean to cut you off, but I know we have some other callers as well who've been so patient. But Brian, can you quickly address Alex's comments?
No, I was just nodding when he talked about that sort of lack of a cohesive or shared strategy. It seems very, right now, very ad hoc, disjointed, which I think adds to that anxiety.
Yeah, 100%. Francis in Webster, you've been so patient. Thank you for sticking on the line. Welcome to Environmental Connections. What is your question?
Thank you. Two items. First, I saw on Facebook, and I know it hasn't been fact-checked, but the current administration, it said, is planning on removing over 8,000 already installed charging stations across the country. The second thing is at our parking lot at the Webster, in the municipal parking lot, there's a 2-car charger unit that's been there for a couple of years, and it's been there longer than that, but it's been out of service for at least 2 years.
Yeah,
and
that's frustrating.
And I stopped into the office, and they said the outfit's in California, and they want $15,000 to fly a technician out here to service it.
Okay.
Eric,
Eric, I just want to throw that one to you. Do you have any thoughts on that, or perhaps you have a bit more information? I'm completely putting you on the spot with this, but what do you think?
Oh, no, of course. No, I think that charging infrastructure has some challenges today. And you know, except for those that drive a Tesla, which uses a pretty reliable network, EV owners know that those chargers are hard to find. They work on many different systems. They're a hassle. They're often broken. I do think this is both something that policymakers are paying attention to, but also this is going to change naturally over time as we get more people adopting EVs. Up until now, most of those EV chargers exist in order to get subsidies. So the motivation to put them in is to absorb subsidies. They're not selling that much electricity to EV drivers. That's not where they make their money. And so you can imagine that means reliability is not of the utmost priority. As we see more EV drivers and more people adopting EVs, we're going to see those EV chargers actually making money from selling you electricity for your car, which means they will need to keep the reliability up. It means that they will need to make it easy to use, and they will want to actually attract customers. And we've seen this with other emerging technologies like wind and solar, where the early technology was not reliable because it was basically just focused on getting subsidies, but it's transitioned to actually making money from its core competency. And then some of the other infrastructure, like the technicians, as well as the installations, the reliability of the technology, the cost of the technology will also come down with scale as we move towards more EVs.
This time went way too fast, you guys. I apologize to folks we did not have time to get to, but thank you so much to State Senator Jeremy Cooney, as well as Brian Sharp and Eric Hittenher, who joined me today for helping us navigate this complex road to electric vehicle adoption in New York. And to those of you tuning in, thanks so much for making today's Environmental Connections.
This program is a production of WXXI Public Radio. The views expressed do not necessarily represent those of this station, its staff, management, or underwriters. The broadcast is meant for the private use of our audience. Any rebroadcast or use in another medium without expressed written consent of WXXI is strictly prohibited. Connections with Evan Dawson is available as a podcast. Just click on the Connections link at WXXInews.org.
Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from Bob Johnson Auto Group, proud supporter of Connections with Evan Dawson. Believing an informed public makes for a stronger community. BobJohnsonAutoGroup.com.